Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel on managing cyber legal risk to industrial systems. My name is Stephen Lilly, and I'm a partner in Mayer Brown Cyber Practice based in DC. The last few years have highlighted the critical importance of securing industrial systems. So what does that mean in practice? We're talking about the systems that operate manufacturing facilities, that support the electric grid, energy and chemical facilities, water treatment facilities, railroads, and countless other critical infrastructure applications. These systems are subject to increasingly severe cyber threats from sophisticated cyber actors, attacks that can have severe consequences, including significant business disruption and safety risks. These cyber threats to industrial systems also pose substantial legal risks, including litigation exposure and the threat of regulatory action. These legal risks are only going to increase in coming years as the Biden administration focuses on industrial cybersecurity. The specific legal risks a business faces will be unique to that company. These risks also are likely to be distinct from the cyber risks that a company faces relating to the data they hold in their financial systems, email servers, and other enterprise systems. That said, the good news is that companies typically can use familiar risk management tools to mitigate the risks posed by industrial cyber threats. For example, this includes assessing the risk, implementing appropriate policies and procedures, allocating risk through contract, ensuring effective governance by senior leaders, and responding effectively when incidents do occur. We'll touch on these topics during our discussion today and are really looking forward to the perspective of our panel of experts. Before we dive into the substance, let me touch on a few administrative points. In a few days, you'll receive a recording of this webinar along with some additional materials you may find useful. If you're interested in CLE, we'll be mentioning a code in the middle and at the end of this program. In the connection details email you received to join this webinar, you'll find links to the forms you need to submit with that code. Finally, if you have questions during the program, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will address those questions as time allows. With that, thank you again for joining, and let me turn it to my partner, Veronica Glick, to introduce our fantastic panel.
Thanks, Stephen. By way of introduction, I'm also a partner in the cybersecurity practice based in Washington, DC. We are very fortunate today to be joined by the group that you can see here on the screen. The panelists represent a broad range of industries and come from different backgrounds with experience working in non-industrial companies and also different branches of the government. So we are joined by Carolyn Budde, Deputy General Counsel, Privacy, Cybersecurity, and Digital, and also Chief Privacy Officer for Baxter International. John Clark, Senior Legal Counsel at Schneider Electric, Sam Singer, Chief Counsel Cyber at Boeing, and Rebecca Steele, Director Emerging Technologies Policy at Toyota Motor North America. And Becca also previously worked in the Senate. So thank you for taking the time today. I look forward to hearing your perspectives. To get us started, could you each tell us a little bit about how industrial cybersecurity features into your work? So I'll turn in order of introductions now to Carolyn, and then John, Sam, and Becca. Feel free to jump in.
So I'm the Privacy, Security, and Digital Attorney at Baxter, and I work with the teams that are responsible not just for our IT infrastructure and data security, but also our operational facilities and our products on security issues as well. I also take the lead on incident response when warranted.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Clark, Senior Legal Counsel at Schneider Electric, global energy management and industrial automation company headquartered in France. One of my roles is supporting our product and system security office on customer-facing cybersecurity issues. So, you know, the cybersecurity factors heavily into our work as a company, and my role specifically supporting our governance organization in furtherance of industrial cybersecurity.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Sam Singer, Chief Counsel for Cyber at Boeing. And as with Caroline and John, you know, the cyber portfolio here within the Boeing Law Department spans not just the standard information security work, but also the product security systems, both on the commercial side and the defense and space side, and including the production environments where we make those products. So it's a wide portfolio, and we work closely with our engineers and security folks in all of those areas, and also our policy and government operations organization on developing and emerging regulatory risks.
Hi all. So I'm I think the only non-lawyer on this call. So my day-to-day work around industrial cybersecurity involves, getting to know more about what we do here at Toyota, but a lot of listening and feedback to policymakers in the government as they try to sort through policy and legislation that can help raise the cybersecurity level of our industrial systems and ensure that, both on a national security level and then from a business continuity standpoint as a country, that we're making a smart policy when it comes to industrial cybersecurity. So lots of time spent in conversations externally outside of Toyota.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. Maybe to kick off, a few sort of detailed questions. One of the topics I think that was sort of touched on by you all was that there are sort of different strands of cybersecurity. So there's the security of your products, there's security of your sort of enterprise systems, and then there's sort of the security of the infrastructure or the industrial systems. And I guess in John's case, they're the same thing. The products are the infrastructure that you're sort of delivering to your clients who will be using it in the electric grid and elsewhere. I think for a lot of people, it's been obvious for a long time that a data breach is a legal issue. Like one of the first calls you're going to make if you suffer a data breach is to your legal team, and you're going to be dealing with sort of regulatory and litigation, potentially contractual issues. Same thing potentially with a product. If it's a medical device or whatever it may be, you're going to have potentially have some legal issues there. Why is, maybe if it's okay, John, I'll start with you. Why is industrial cybersecurity a legal issue? Why is it something that the legal team needs to be involved in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Stephen. I think you summed it up both, there and in your earlier introduction. It kind of goes without saying, but there have been significant changes in the landscape, cybersecurity landscape over the past several years. And from Schneider's perspective, those changes are featuring more prominently in sort of the story that we're telling as a company. A growing risk area, increased efforts, by bad actors and targeted actions against companies, individuals, our customers, state-sponsored attacks. Within Schneider alone, we have folks who are tracking cybersecurity activity from the regulatory perspective, something like 60 in-process pieces of legislation. As to industrial cybersecurity as a legal issue, our subject matter experts and our organizations, that are dedicated to cybersecurity, they need the guidance on navigating the landscape, which again is changing and in some cases getting scarier by the day. But legal, provides one arm of that support function, and that would typically be how we view it as a legal issue.
That's a great summary. And Carolyn or Sam, if you have any other thoughts to add on that front.
I was just going to say, I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm not sure that if you had gone back to 2010, that the security teams would have thought that cybersecurity was a legal issue, whether it was data or not data. I think the role of the lawyer in security has grown over the course of the last 10 years, and never more so in the last few years, which I think John did a really adept job at highlighting. I find that more and more security teams are welcoming welcoming the legal team and giving them a seat at the table, in the legal role, but also just as a practical spokesperson and someone to support the team.
So relatedly on that topic, we often with lawyers talk about meeting regulatory expectations of these evolving processes for managing legal risk. But many of your companies also face existing safety and quality regulations. So and maybe I'll turn to Sam for this one, if that's okay. I'd be interested in hear how you're kind of managing, balancing those two factors.
Sure. It's an interesting question because, in many respects, critical infrastructure operators tend to be highly regulated, right? And in terms of things they make and the machines they use to make them, they're more likely than most companies to be subject to safety, quality, configuration requirements. With cyber being a sort of a conspicuous exception. And if you are a critical infrastructure operator trying to figure out how sort of the regulatory frameworks that have existed in your sector or industry for decades interact with these sort of emerging cyber regimes, I think there's really just one of two possibilities, right? Your regulator has either explained that interaction, they have actually specified the ways in which cybersecurity requirements are have been integrated or supplement existing regulatory frameworks, or they haven't, in which case you essentially have to do that work yourself. So like to give an example, like in the former category, and maybe John could probably speak to this more, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has for years regulated bulk energy distribution under a reliability standard. They're really focused on reliable, stable, distribution of bulk energy, and they have specifically delineated cybersecurity requirements and explained how they interact with the reliability standard. In the national security space, the DoD, the intelligence community, if you do business with them, they will not leave it to contractors to try to figure out how cyber figures into some of the overarching program security or counterintelligence or supply chain requirements at the contract level. But there are many areas where those express cyber requirements aren't there, and it's left to the regulated entity or a contractor to try to figure out how when a cyber vulnerability, for instance, becomes a safety issue, right? Now, if your requirement is to keep a safe workplace at a chemical facility, when exactly does a set of cyber risk, rise to the level of, something that's regulatory, actionable from a regulatory standpoint? And that is, I think, where the real challenge is. We have that issue in aerospace to some respect, and I know that it's not limited to that industry. So I think that'll change. I think the sector-specific regulators will fill in the details more and more and start doing what FERC is doing in the energy world, and supplementing their regulatory regimes with cyber requirements. But for now, there's a lot of sort of open questions out there in terms of the interaction between cyber and safety and cyber and quality and things like that.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. I think it sounds like really hard questions in a gray zone where you're having to bring to bear sort of good judgment from, presumably drawing on analogies to the extent you can and other legal frameworks. But I think it also goes back to that first question of why is this a legal issue? I think we just saw a really good demonstration of why you would probably want to be talking to your lawyers about, whether SAM or otherwise in your organization, about these really interesting questions. I think Sam was mentioning, regulators sort of filling in gaps. And, I think that's one thing we are beginning to see, and we're also beginning to see, DHS, CISA putting out sort of goals and sort of that seem to be intended to sort of fill gaps where there aren't regulatory frameworks in place. And overall, it just feels like there's an enormous amount of policy activity with respect to industrial cybersecurity at the moment. So we've got, specifically calling out operational technology in the Cyber EO, the National Security Memorandum, the DHS pipeline directive, and then indications there's going to be a similar directive for railroads and probably more to come. And there's also an intense focus on critical infrastructure, or a particular focus on critical infrastructure and cyber incident reporting legislation. And maybe Becca, a question for you is, it feels like industrial technology is sort of having a moment from a policy perspective. Is that right? And if that's right, like what's driving that?
Sure. I think all cybersecurity is having a moment at this point in time, but especially industrial, and something that people had not thought about because they don't see it in their everyday lives. They see the fruits of it in their everyday life, but they don't actually see it like they see something like ransomware or phishing email or something like that. So I think people have become more aware. There's been supply chain attacks that people are more aware of. There's been, different industrial systems, cybersecurity risk areas that are now, being brought to light. And it's very interesting in the US because our critical infrastructure is so heavily held in the private sector. And that's really what regular lawmakers on the Hill, especially, are trying to figure out. How do we get the visibility that we need into the incidents that are happening so that we can play ahead, right? That we're not just always playing catch up, and that maybe there's a larger picture here that we can put together if we have this, this information. So the Hill in particular, in the House and the Senate, have been very focused on cyber incident reporting legislation for critical infrastructure. Basically, what is the threshold for mandatory incident reporting? What types of incidents have to be reported? What types of entities have to, are subject to this? What is the, the turnaround time? Is it 24 hours? Is it 72 hours? So we've had some legislation that is, moved in the House. There was a markup in the Senate, and so we'll see what happens. But I would, if I'm a betting person, there's going to be cyber incident legislation that likely passes and is signed into law. So really starting to talk to your government affairs teams, if you haven't already, about what's moving there, and get plugged in because it is moving. And then the other piece the lawmakers are really attuned to, because it happens so often to their own constituents on an individual or a small business basis, is ransomware. And so you're seeing some efforts now to require, should there be legislation to require reporting of ransom payments to the government from certain entities, in order to, again, see if there's patterns, see if the government can, if there's better public-private collaboration that can happen to maybe prevent some of those issues moving forward, or spot kind of like watch outs or holes in our system that we can all work together collaboratively to fix.
Thanks, Rebecca. Very interesting. There's clearly a lot happening and moving quickly. So as Congress is thinking about the specifics of cyber toward critical infrastructure and industrial systems, be interesting to hear from this group, from your experiences, what industrial cyber risk management has in common with enterprise risk management, and so the ways that they differ. So maybe I'll turn first to Carolyn, and then John and Sam will weigh in as well.
So I'm a strong believer that you should always turn back to the fundamentals. And I think with respect to the fundamentals, they are consistent across all different types of cybersecurity. You need strong discipline and strong cyber hygiene. Obviously, your environments are different, your products might be different, your systems may be different, your risks and vulnerabilities might be different, but ultimately the frameworks that you apply, or the way that you think about them, should be common. I'm a huge fan of risk assessments and conducting risk assessments. Your policies and procedures and incident response plans are all going to serve as a foundation. And obviously you're going to tweak them given your environment, or you're going to tweak them given the type of situation that you're in. I'm also a big proponent of tabletop exercises. They're going to be very similar in nature or in construct, but you're going to have different scenarios and probably different players from your business that would participate in them. And honestly, often you don't know the full scope of an incident when you're looking at it. I mean, if something comes in, you're often not going to be sitting there saying, okay, this is absolutely an industrial cyber risk management, or this is absolutely something that's going to hit our infrastructure. It tends to be much messier than that. So the more consistency that you can have across the board in the way that you approach things, and pull people in and pull people out depending on how things evolve, I think the better off you're going to be. Having multiple plans or multiple ways of doing things can sometimes be very disruptive internally.
Yeah, I mean, Caroline, I echo everything you just said. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Strong discipline, hygiene, common threads, common themes. On the OT side, I would just say that, a little bit of a difference, right, would be technology as part of a critical infrastructure. I mean, versus your enterprise side of the house. Bringing a different level of attention, and I think what Becca sort of touched on earlier from a regulatory perspective of trying to stay ahead instead of playing falling back and playing defense, but otherwise agree fully with everything you said.
This is something that lawmakers are struggling with as well. I would just add on to what you said, Caroline, of when does this become an incident? What is this affecting? And when do we need to report as we're trying to gather information? And so lawmakers are really grappling with the fact that a cybersecurity situation and incident is often fluid, and you may not know what the ramifications are within a certain reporting threshold. And so that's something that to pay close attention to, that you may be eventually reporting out as you're evolving your response throughout a cyber security incident.
Yeah, I think I would just add that, focusing more, I guess, more on the differences, and I agree that there's certainly more in common than there is different, but it'll be interesting to see how regulators draw distinctions between sort of the IT and operational technology, if they draw distinctions. If you're going to impose a patching requirement or vulnerability management requirement on a company without drawing that distinction, right, you are setting yourself up for some challenges, right? Because patching an industrial control system that needs to be running all the time to keep a production line open is obviously different in many respects than patching a IT system, and just the difference in the consequences of a cyber attack and safety consequences on the production side versus IP theft. So that those are real distinctions, real different disciplines from a cybersecurity perspective, and it's still not clear to me the extent to which regulators will be accounting for that as they're imposing these new requirements.
That's really interesting. Great, really great perspectives. There's one thing I've seen, and maybe give everyone a chance to tell me I'm wrong, but one thing I've seen as well is that there can sometimes be sort of slight cultural differences between sort of the IT security team and the team that's responsible for the security of the infrastructure, which may be the team that's responsible for maintaining the uptime or maintaining the safety, and whereas the IT team may have sort of security and have that relationship with legal and have that sort of perspective built in. It feels like in some of the circumstances I've seen, there's more of an education process that when you go and have that conversation that Sam was talking about why it's necessary to patch a machine that is critical to the business or otherwise can't be touched. That my sense is that can be a challenge as well. But I think going back to something Carolyn said very early on, one of the roles that legal can play is sort of the internal diplomat or advocate for various positions, and it feels like that's an important relationship building function that that legal can play. Certainly happy to be corrected if anybody wants to disagree with that perspective, but that's an interesting point of reference. So, and I guess one other sort of theme we're seeing when we work with clients is, I think Carolyn, you and John, particularly you were mentioning this idea that like the distinctions aren't always going to be totally clear. And Sam, in prior conversations, you've highlighted the sort of the convergence of IT and OT as sort of a big issue, and that's certainly something. Anytime you talk about industrial cyber risk, convergence of IT and OT is a topic that comes up. How does that affect that convergence? How does that affect cyber risk management? Is that a big issue? Is that a minor detail? How does it play out?
Yeah, no, I think it's a big issue. I mean, I think it's really a defining issue. With digital transformation, right? That's the buzzword. Everything is now about simplifying and streamlining and APIs and dashboards, and people want to run entire factories from smartphones. And that's exciting, right? And I have no doubt that sort of the benefits of innovation in this area will, outstrip the cost and the risk. But those risks are real, especially when you start talking about managing industrial control systems from the cloud. For all of the reasons that ICS and legal risks associated with industrial control systems have sort of been a backwater for cyber lawyers for the last decade. They will all sort of become front and center, right? Because the day-to-day rhythm of IT, incident response, vulnerability management, things like that all of a sudden become industrial control issues, right? Because if it's a cloud platform that's vulnerable and that cloud platform is controlling, your production systems, you now have, a whole different set of issues to deal with on top of the standard IT issues. So that convergence is real, and it complicates, obviously, the point I made before about drawing distinctions in between these types of systems and regulations, because at least there are technologies that are really bridging that divide more and more. So it definitely is changing the way it works, at least in-house from a legal perspective.
Yeah, and as you're thinking of sort of managing these challenges, I want to jump back to something Carolyn mentioned, tabletop exercises, but there's this whole kind of toolkit that we usually talk about for managing cyber legal risk assessments, policies, and so on. Have you, this group, sort of developed any particular lessons on how best to manage these foundational elements of a cyber risk management program specific to this industrial cyber context? So maybe Carolyn, since you mentioned tabletops, I'll turn back to you, but obviously other folks feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in the cyber context, and we've all been talking about how rapidly it's been evolving and how many changes, and certainly from a regulatory or legislative perspective, we're seeing that in the United States, we're seeing that globally. And I think, between that and just the news cycle, I think it's very easy to get distracted or to, go after the solution of the day or the control of the day, or the issue of the day, the threat of the day. And I think coming back and really looking at these, making sure that you have the right framework, making sure that your fundamentals are sound, making sure that you have that discipline in place is going to get you a lot further. So my biggest lesson would just be don't get distracted by the day-to-day. Keep the course. Obviously, maintain your awareness about what's going on. I think that's critical. Frankly, that's part of your fundamentals. But don't get so distracted by it that you're constantly chasing the ball. It really is important to field the team.
And I'd echo all of that again. Sound fundamentals, and particularly on the Schneider side, right? We've been really focused on establishing, consistent cyber risk management processes and consistently following those processes to manage your risk, right? So, a governance organization that is going to enforce and ensure that those processes are being followed. So, again, staying abreast of things as they change, but having that framework in place to mitigate the risk, when it comes up and do it consistently is very key.
Yep. I want to go back to a comment that Sam made about sort of the practical challenges of securing some of these systems. Like, for example, if it's difficult to put a patch on a system, oftentimes you may not have visibility into all of these systems. There may not be sort of the ability to push patches to them if they're remote. There may be other sort of practical challenges. Maybe for you to start with John, and then would welcome Sam and Carolyn's comments. How do these sort of practical challenges, which are distinct from an enterprise system where you can throw away a laptop if you need to, or push a patch on Patch Tuesday or whatever it is, how do those practical challenges feed into the approach to industrial cyber risk management?
Yeah, I mean, they are challenges, right? I mean, they are significant challenges, and especially in the context of legacy products, right? Where perhaps something was created with a Ethernet port in it 10, 15 years ago that's still in use, and you have really it now presents a risk that maybe didn't exist before, or wasn't as significant before, as it could be whatever the device is, could be something that allows bad actor to get into a system in another way. So managing those risks, in the context of customer demand and expectation, which is increased. And also, historical and legacy products. I mean, it's something that, from a contracting perspective, the lesson learned, I guess, and the best way to move forward, in my opinion, is just very clear contracting, with suppliers and customers on to define the roles and responsibilities with respect to these challenges, right? So, who owns responsibilities for patching, SLAs tied to uptime and things like that. I mean, unfortunately, I wish I had a silver bullet answer for those challenges. Again, particularly from a legacy product perspective, but it's something that best you can try and paper it clearly to define those roles.
That's great, John. I don't know if Sam or Carolyn want to offer a silver bullet, but I imagine that may not be available. But
I wish. The only thing I would say is that whether it's industrial or just your IT infrastructure, nothing ever quite looks the way that you want it to. Certainly there are unique challenges here, and I don't want to downplay them, but I think it's really important to look at, the full spectrum of your controls. Contracting is one of them, certainly, but just to think about whether or not you may not be able to implement your controller choice, and you may not be able to do exactly what you want to do, but there are a myriad of compensating controls that you can use to address whatever risk you're dealing with. And so making sure that you understand the full spectrum of them and that you're documenting them appropriately, I think is really important.
And that's a great point. And just to piggyback off that as well, right? I mean, being able to get that messaging out, right? And it goes back to the earlier discussion about consistent processes, right? So if there's something that a message that needs to get out, having a consistent way of doing that, and of course compensating controls, mitigation, and all of that you can reach to, get to your customers in some way, shape, or form, right? Which is better than nothing. But I think that goes back to the strong fundamentals part of the discussion.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I would add, it's also sort of foundational. Asset management. I think anyone who tries to address this issue comprehensively will immediately realize that the inventories and like configuration policies that govern sort of corporate IT do not necessarily extend to the far-flung remote production environments, which are often run by different businesses or subsidiaries, right? And so you being able to get a hold of the actual assets and being able to identify and track and figure out who's responsible for those systems as opposed to the corporate IT systems is pretty important, and especially when it comes down to crunch time, like a serious vulnerability is reported that cuts across various systems. You want to have that asset management system in place to be able to extend your processes in response beyond sort of the water's edge of IT.
Thanks. Yeah, these are very helpful guideposts. And to your point, Sam, now I want to pick up on something you'd actually mentioned earlier, which I think is a good question for Rebecca on this point. Do you think that policymakers are attuned to some of these unique challenges we've been talking about that are associated with securing industrial systems?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the policymaker and what their area of expertise or their experience is in. I think if you're talking to somebody who does a lot, the defense space and the Armed Services Committee, they understand some of these more like legacy systems that you can put into something, and it's maybe not going to change. People who've gone to a plant understand that. They've seen these giant systems on the floor and they can just push something. Like, this is something that was put in here 20 years ago. So I think that it's getting there. I think what they don't necessarily always see, which is sometimes a good thing, is they don't have it just siloed, as in like, today we're going to approach regulating or legislating on industrial cybersecurity. It's more of these like, can you meet these goals? What are these risks that we're trying to manage for? And then our job is to go in and say, we can manage for these risks in these ways, but in different environments, we're going to have different approaches to doing that. And you just got to make the best do with what you have and the technology that you're using. If something doesn't accept a patch or is connected to the Ethernet and it's going to take days or weeks, that's our job to explain to policymakers. This isn't for lack of effort. This is just the way that the systems are built, and they are. So I think we're getting there. We're definitely ahead from where we were. And when you're seeing legislation being crafted, it's a lot of sending something goals to a rulemaking that an agency with more expertise is going to be able to dive into, which is, I think, preferable than a very prescriptive bill coming out of Congress. And they're deferring a lot to the work that NIST is doing, or NTIA or DHS with those experts over there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the distinction between sort of general legislation and more specific requirements. I mean, one of the areas where you do see more specific requirements is in the government contracting space. And maybe a question for Sam, particularly in light of the executive order, what are sort of the particular considerations for industrial cybersecurity that government contractors are navigating at the moment?
If we're talking about the executive order, then obviously, if you are a company that sells industrial control systems to the government or develops industrial control software for the government or software that can be used on a platform that controls the industrial control system, you need to be paying attention to Section 4 of the order and the government's evolving understanding of critical software and the security requirements that attach to that understanding, as well as the software bill of material, sort of proof of concept that they're developing, and other standards that will essentially apply directly to your business. If you're not in that category, if you're just a government contractor, that has industrial control systems but sells other goods or services to the government, you still should pay attention. Certainly, the information sharing requirements, I think it's Section 2, those new requirements will have direct impacts on you at an organizational level, and it'd be interesting to see how they sort of jive with the emerging reporting requirements that were discussed earlier, the congressionally mandated reporting requirements that we're likely to see that were discussed earlier. And then there's just sort of this expectation that these standards will sort of trickle down, into industry and across industries from the prime contractor levels. So even if the requirements don't apply to you, it's not implausible that they will become sort of industry best practices, and obviously just something to think about from a strategic or long-term perspective. But outside the government, the recent executive order, contractors focusing on ISC cybersecurity should be paying attention to the IoT Cybersecurity Act, which is live and in the process of being fleshed out. That will impose direct requirements on the design and management of IoT devices and potential IoT vulnerabilities for contractors, right? And that's an act of Congress that's being implemented right now. And then obviously the emerging critical infrastructure regulations. The critical infrastructure is now a regulatory category that Congress is apparently comfortable targeting. And if you are a contractor with industrial control systems, it's not just government contract requirements that you're going to have to think about, right? The recent National Security Memorandum that outlines performance goals for critical infrastructure companies, voluntary but could easily become mandatory, and sort of these new security directives coming out of DHS, targeting specific sectors, I think should be a warning to any critical infrastructure sector that this could be sort of a new and emerging area for regulatory requirements.
Thanks, Sam. Really interesting. I have a follow-up question for Rebecca on this point on the executive order, but we just have to take one moment to show the CLE code, which will also be in the chat for the group listening. So I'll just keep that up for a moment while I ask the question. But so to this point, when the executive order was rolled out, there were indications that the government, as Sam mentioned, would seek to impose similar requirements beyond the government contracting space. So I'd be particularly interested, Rebecca, from your view, do you think that's still the goal? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, so we haven't seen the administration, or agencies explicitly say that. I think this is, this is a full-on sprint. If you look at the EO, some of these deadlines and the product that's being turned out is really happening very rapidly, at least in terms of the government. So I think that it's setting a floor and the expectation for what it means to have good cyber hygiene and good risk management processes. And when you don't sell to the federal government, you are most likely still interacting with companies and suppliers that do. And so, it's kind of going to lift all boats, but it is the floor. And so I think there's a hard case to make if you're going in to talk to a lawmaker about why you're not meeting something just because you don't sell directly to the federal government. And so I think the executive order is a first step. We'll see all the work products that come out of that. There's been really good engagement with industry so far on these items, and we'll see what happens moving forward. And we are one random incident away from a totally different direction sometimes in legislation based on what's dominating the news coverage. So there's always that caveat.
Talking about the different tools for risk management, maybe going back to a comment, John, you previously made, I think you've already sort of outlined how you think about allocating risk by contract. But maybe you could just give a little bit more on what you're seeing to the extent you can, sort of in terms of the market. Like, I think you sort of mentioned that expectations are rising in terms of how, or there's increased focus maybe among contracting parties on the allocation of this specific cyber risk in contracts. Is that right? And how's that sort of playing out as you see the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a contracting perspective, similar to what we've heard a lot about from Becca and Sam from the regulatory perspective, right, is an increased awareness and pressure from customers, right, from the contractual perspective, right. So we're seeing 5 years ago, even a couple years ago, right, maybe from in your contract, whatever it is, your sales contract, there'd be a paragraph or a page or two on cybersecurity, if that, oftentimes more tied to data privacy, and a line here or there about patching and vulnerabilities and updates, right? Providing updates, and all of those terms now have, I think, more significant meaning. And in terms of trends, right? I mean, getting a contract from a customer and their template has a 20-page exhibit on cybersecurity with respect to all of that, right? Vulnerability management, patching, SLAs, life cycle. So just, I'd say, more significant expectation from the customers that manufacturers, suppliers will be providing this level of kind of protection to them. And it's something Sam said earlier about, wanting to run a factory from a smartphone. I mean, I absolutely, the market's demanding connected devices, right? I mean, everything is IoT, everything, ideally running from a smartphone, but by virtue of being connected, right, those products carry a heightened risk. So I think just from going back to, the earlier discussions about trying to mitigate through, contract, right, a really holistic look at the way you procure from your suppliers as a manufacturer, and how you apportion and mitigate risk in your sales contract through your customer, right? Because I think that today, right, securable products is not necessarily the fundamental issue. It's actions that the parties need to take, and particularly with a customer, right? Again, going back to the trends, Stephen, you supplier do everything and carry all the liability, but trying to shift a little of the obligations back to the customer to reasonably apportion it, because you can't be just appear on site, right? And Becky's the example of, like, you walk into a factory and there's massive machinery and downtime and all of that. So if this trend is going to continue of connected everything, which of course I think we all know it is, those risks will continue, and just trying to contract clearly around those risks.
Thanks, John. Very interesting. And I wanted to pivot a little bit here because we have very global companies, and we know from experience, one major challenge in the cyberspace in general is looking at differing, sometimes competing expectations and requirements from regulators, consumers, all kinds of third parties. So I'd be really interested to hear how this group manages industrial cyber risk on a global basis. Maybe I'll turn first to Carolyn, if that's okay, and then to Sam and John to weigh in on that.
Sure. I mean, I think, and it's funny because as I was listening to the other panelists talk about the new legislation, and certainly as we start to dig into the more prescriptive requirements that we might be seeing, prescriptive controls, for example, that we may be seeing in new legislation, it makes me very nervous, because the more prescriptive any one law is, the more difficult it is to comply with. And it may not be the right thing for a particular environment, a particular situation. But I do think that there is a tendency to dig in to say, and this isn't necessarily relevant in the industrial space, but encryption is the key. And it may be in certain contexts, and it may not be in other contexts. So, I guess that I go back to when you're managing on an managing industrial cybersecurity risk, or managing, any cybersecurity risk globally, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, going back to those fundamentals, understanding your control framework, understanding your environment, your threats, your vulnerabilities, your risks that are unique to you, and making sure that you've mapped those appropriately are going to put you in the best position possible in any geography, in any legislative scheme, and any regulatory scheme that you're in. There are no doubt unique challenges relating to industrial cybersecurity. There are unique challenges to cybersecurity in general. But again, I mean, the more prescriptive, the more difficult that becomes.
And I'll sound like a broken record too, because I echo everything Caroline just said. But yeah, I mean, fundamentals, have a process and follow that process, right, from a global perspective, and be consistent.
Yeah, the only thing I've observed as an outside counsel is that sometimes in-house counsel for global companies who are managing these issues maintain incredibly grueling hours as well. So I know that, certainly the Schneider legal team is often doing phone calls on European time, and I know we've done, various things on Asian time as well. So it's, I know that is one practical challenge that you guys, I know, always rise to. Becca, you mentioned with respect to policy that we're sort of one sort of unexpected incident away from being, everybody's sort of laser-like focus in Congress now is on, it was on a pipeline attack. Now it's going to be on this, and that might drive policymaking in a sort of a either unexpected direction, or may accelerate things in a sort of unexpected way. So with that huge caveat that, there is a certain sort of like news cycle arbitrariness to the way that policy ultimately gets made, so it is hard to predict. Nonetheless, going to put you on the spot. What do you see coming? Like what's on the horizon from a policy perspective? Is there going to be more focus on this on an ongoing basis, or is this going to be something that, like we said, like has its moment, but maybe that moment's going to end in the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think cybersecurity is here to stay, the good ways, and then also the threats, right? So I think now it's part of the repertoire of the issues that members, especially on committees with jurisdiction over that, are thinking about every day. It is in front of them. Their constituents are dealing with it. The businesses in their communities are dealing with it, and they're also dealing with it this big national security angle, right? And in terms of, the economic health of our nation. So when you read a lot of this legislation, it's not just about a national security risk. It's about something that's really going to disrupt the national economy, like a pipeline, for example. So I think they're going to continue to focus. Cybersecurity is going to be here to stay. I think you're going to see more focus in the near term on things like ransomware and getting incident reporting across the finish line. And then I think they'll start as they're picking those apart and as these go into implementing, I mean, this kind of incident reporting is an outgrowth of the fact that, we had incident sharing, Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, and they're not getting as much information as anticipated or the right types of information. And so there's these outgrowths based on what the results are of legislation that is passed or of policies that are done. So I think it's going to be evolving, certainly not boring. And October will not be the only month that we are discussing cybersecurity on the Hill every year.
Very true. So again, really appreciate the kind of collective experience and wisdom of this panel. So one question I appreciate asking is, what's one key takeaway that you would offer to the attendees today? Maybe I'll start back with Rebecca, then Carolyn, John, and Sam. But Rebecca, since you were continuing.
There's going to be more legislation and more regulation. So the better that you can follow those things now and anticipate them, the better off you're going to be in the work you're going to save yourself and your teams when they actually go into place. So talk to your government affairs team, talk to your regulatory team is my takeaway.
Thanks, Rebecca. Carolyn?
So I think it's a really very dynamic space. It's very easy to get lost in the technology. It's very easy to get lost in the news cycle and the changes that keep coming every day, and to get a little overwhelmed by even where to start. So I would say, again, get your core fundamentals in place, understand your environments, understand your controls. And that way, when things do evolve, whether that be from a regulatory context, whether that be from a threat perspective, whether that be, in any way, shape, or form, you have context for those changes, and you can implement changes across the board through that framework. And it's going to allow you to have much more consistency across the board and help you not get lost in all of those changes.
Yeah, and just, strong processes, governance, consistency, staying ahead of this very, at the risk of stating the obvious and oversimplifying, but evolving and changing, topic. It's just going to continue to grow and be, one of, if not the most important, topic that companies face today. So consistency, fundamentals, governance.
I guess I would just reiterate, I think one of the points I made earlier is because a lot of the focus will be on these new emerging critical infrastructure regulations, but whatever sector you're in, do consider the ways in which a cybersecurity risk might interact with other regulatory frameworks, whether they're safety focused, reliability focused, or whatever, because that is a I think underappreciated risk. And it applies across critical infrastructure sectors.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam. And we're starting to get this really, really helpful set of guidance there. We're starting to get some questions that we'll turn over in a moment. But as a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. Even if we don't get to them now, we can follow up after. One question we have, so maybe I'll turn to you, Stephen, on this. What kind of governmental actions should be undertaken to respond to foreign cyber attacks?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly the Biden administration has really emphasized the need to push back on foreign cyber attacks, whether that be ransomware attacks, which has obviously been a particular focus, or other sort of nation state attacks that might be geared towards espionage or other types of threats to American businesses or the American government itself. I think the basics of that policy seem to be sort of twofold. One is to strengthen systems and networks in the United States. And, we've seen a range of different actions that the government has taken, both with respect to government systems, directly through the executive order, for example, undertaking efforts to move to zero trust architecture and other types of steps to harden government systems against attack, pushing government contractors to raise their, I'm sure in many cases they're already there, but to meet new cybersecurity standards by contracts and through other means, taking regulatory action, and then pushing for legislation that would increase reporting and make other changes. Everything that's sort of a huge bucket of things, diverse sort of policy approaches, all sort of intended to increase visibility and strengthen networks and systems here in the US from attack. And then the second part of it is to use sanctions, prosecution of foreign threat actors and other sort of diplomatic tools to try to impose consequences on those actors themselves or the countries that harbor them. I think there's a two-day ransomware event starting today at the White House is hosting with a range of other allied countries to talk through strategy and how to sort of beat back the scourge and impose consequences on bad actors. I think that seems to be the approach. I don't really have perspective to offer to what they should be doing differently. This is happening behind closed doors, so we'll see exactly how it plays out and what the end result is. But that certainly seems like the key building blocks, or the right building blocks. Taking this threat seriously and engaging with foreign countries on these points. I don't know if anybody in the panel wanted to add to that, but that's at least my sense of what this administration is focusing on to sort of try to respond to that threat. As we can take another question.
So another couple that maybe I'll group these together and feel free to address. I'll turn it back to you, Stephen, but the ones that we have time for. One question is specific to incident response. We've talked about ransomware, but incidents do they have to be treated differently for industrial cybersecurity as opposed to general enterprise cybersecurity? And then we've also got a question about the occasion of increased use of civil FCA provisions by the cybersecurity for cybersecurity fraud. So potentially there's some more teeth behind some of the regulations using kind of misrepresentation of cyber capabilities as another angle to hold companies to a certain standard.
Yeah, I mean, those are both really interesting questions. I think the FCA question, there's the question of how misrepresentations about cybersecurity programs. There's also the reporting obligation that sort of, or the obligation, whether it's going to be through contract or otherwise. I think that ties back into the incident response question, which is how do you respond effectively to incidents? How do you notify appropriate people? What have you? That we probably could spend a whole session on incident response alone. But I think to the points that the panel made, and would love any sort of feedback or different views. I think the fundamentals are really, really important here. So having the right people in the room, having a policy or plan that you're following, not deviating from that, having escalation to senior members of the leadership, so you can make those critical decisions. That if you have to make a notification to the government, you talk to the right people within the company to make sure that trigger has been met, or to make sure you don't fail to make a notification. I think that the building blocks are going to be the same as in other cyber contexts. The team members may be different, and I guess the one sort of practical suggestion I'd have is making sure you know who those team members are going to be and build those relationships in advance is very, very important. I don't know if anybody else wanted to weigh in on those questions, but that's at least some initial thoughts.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Stephen. No, I was just going to largely, echo what you said, right? The IT versus OT side. I mean, the consistency across the, making sure the right process is in place. Again, it's oftentimes going to be different team members, but taking that sort of holistic approach, right? That this is the topic within your organization, and it might be two separate streams, but ensuring that it is holistic, because oftentimes something that happens internally from an internal organizational perspective can have repercussions on externally on the customer facing side as well, right? So just making sure that again, I really sound like a broken record, but clear processes, consistency, and the right folks dialed in, and making sure that those organizations and governance are working together, talking together, and making sure that looking at it from a higher level when needed.
That's a great comment, I think, to leave on. Really great theme that really drew, we drew through the pretty much most of the discussion. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us this morning. In particular, thank you to John, Becca, Sam, and Carolyn for sharing your time and sort of your incredible perspective. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone soon.